Hello, everybody. This is Zaxtor99. Welcome to yet another Chiller series. This is going to be episode number 2, and I found this particular short story over on Reddit No Sleep. If you guys have recently submitted, or even years ago submitted a short story that you believe would make a great short story for my new Chiller series, be sure you submit your story. Just send me an email, shoot me the link to your short story that you've submitted, or maybe you just read one over on the No Sleep at Reddit that you think would make a great short story. Be sure you submit that to my email submission email address at chillersubmission@yahoo.com. I will definitely be reading all these emails and any short stories that I think are great. If you're the original writer, be sure you let me know. Obviously, that's giving me permission. I am asking permission for every short story that I read from the original author because that's the right thing to do. Again, that's chillersubmission@yahoo.com. That's an email address. Well, I'll be checking and reading those emails and looking for great new short stories to read in upcoming Chillers videos right here on my YouTube channel. So with that, guys, let's go ahead and get started with episode number 2 right here. This short story comes from The White Mare, and the short story will be linked down below in the description. My sister brought home a stray dog. There's something terribly wrong with it. It had been raining for most of the day. Yesterday's forecast was for a light rain shower, but this was torrential. I peeked out at the window, into the darkness in the late afternoon, and I could see a river of rain water cascading down either side of the street. My parents were getting worried about my sister. Emily had spent the day at a friend's house and was supposed to be back an hour ago. Just as my dad was about to get in his car and go drive around the block to try to find her, the front door opened. Emily walked in dressed in her yellow raincoat. Much to my parents' chagrin, she was holding on to a worn collar of an old, soaking wet dog. The thing was a mongrel, but I could make out the Alsatian in it. Maybe some golden retriever. As I tried to work it out, I made a mental note to put a dog breeder down on my list of career interests for school. My parents exchanged apprehensive glances as Emily smiled awkwardly and explained how she found him shivering in the rain on the side of the road. There was something about his eyes, she said, that made her instantly feel sorry for the poor guy. My dad knelt by the dog and had a look at its collar. The collar was battered, its red color fading, and it had no name, phone number, or address written on it. My father stood up with a sigh and told Emily that he'd bring the mutt to the vet on Thursday to see if it had been chipped. And for the 5 days until then, looking after it would be her responsibility. Emily beamed at my dad and took the dog into the kitchen to towel it down. Later on that evening, she brought it back into the living room and informed us that his name was Buster. My father warned against getting too attached, but she didn't listen. She spent the rest of the day playing with Buster and sending pictures of him to all her friends. That night, Buster slept on a makeshift bed of old blankets and cardboard in the kitchen. My parents prayed that he would not make a mess of the place that night. Emily hugged Buster and gave him another treat before rushing off to her room. In the morning, all was well. It looked like Buster hadn't moved an inch. The dopey guy barely looked up at us when we crowded into the kitchen for breakfast. Immediately, Emily knelt beside him, rubbing his tummy and stroking his fur. I think Emily was too afraid of taking Buster for a walk, just in case she bumped into his real owners, and they dragged him away from her. The garden had turned into mud the day before, and there wasn't a chance in hell that my mother would let that dog back into the house if he had a trace of muck on his paws. So he, like the rest of us, spent that day cooped up inside. Not that he seemed to mind at all. My dad cooked up a lamb chop for Buster that night. At Emily's request, it was the most animated I've ever seen him. His eyes lit up as it was placed in front of him, and we all erupted into laughter as he tore into it. That night, I jolted awake. The radio alarm clock on my bedside cabinet informed me, in analog red light, that it was 4:37 a.m. I lay there and quickly began to fall back to sleep. And as I could have sworn I heard something moving around in the hallway. I assumed it was just my dad, stumbling to the bathroom in a drunken stupor, and, for the second time that night, sleep took over me. I spent most of the next day hanging out with friends around town. We rode our bikes, threw stones at the windows of the old house on Mill Street, and dared each other to shoplift from a local off-brand gas station. I made off with a packet of apple-flavored chewing gum. When I came home, things felt different, hostile even. I didn't want to ask what happened, but before I could sneak off to my room, my mother told me. Emily had accidentally knocked over my grandfather's urn while playing with Buster in the front room. I suppressed a chuckle at the thought of how much trouble she'd be getting in. Mature of me, I know. That evening there was silence around the dinner table, broken only by Buster's whining. I woke up again that night. This time I swung myself out of the bed. My mouth was dry and my breath left a stale taste at the back of my throat. I wandered downstairs into the kitchen to get a glass of water. I tried to be as quiet as possible, not wanting to disturb the sleeping dog. Buster slept soundly in his little bed, and I knew a freight train going past wouldn't even wake him. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it in one continuous gulp. And then an idea came to me. I crouched by the cabinet my dad kept his whiskey in. I opened it, trying not to let the hinges creak. I picked out a bottle and stood up. I gently unscrewed the cap, and I took a sip. I coughed and choked, and I sputtered. As I went for another sip, I heard movement upstairs. I knew my father would kill me if he caught me drinking. I hastily put the cap back on and placed it back into the cupboard. I sped walked out of the kitchen, desperate not to make any noise. Just before I began ascending the stairs, I heard the door to my parents' room open. I quickly turned around and hid in the living room. I heard my father walk down the stairs and walk into the kitchen. My heart was beating like a tribal drum as I hurried out of the living room, and I stepped, agonizingly loudly, up each creaky step back up to my bedroom. I thought I had made it, but just as I was pushing my bedroom door open, I heard a voice behind me, and it was my father. He popped his head out of his bedroom. He asked if it was me moving around. I told him that I had just gone downstairs to get a glass of water. He told me to keep it down, and before he retreated back into the darkness of his room, I saw my mother stirring in the bed behind him, and then he closed the door. That morning I woke up with a migraine headache. Nothing too major, but it was a drawback from what would have otherwise been a great day. My sister was at some dance club, my mother was visiting the solicitor in town, and my father had gone golfing that day. On this rare occasion, I had the house to myself. Well, me and the dog. I found a strongly worded note on the kitchen table when I woke up. It was left by my sister Emily, telling me how I should feed and entertain Buster while she was gone. I crumpled the note up and accepted to throw it into the bin from across the room, but I missed horribly. I made myself the unhealthiest breakfast I could possibly think of. I took it into the living room to eat it while I settled down to watch the film. Dan O'Bannon's Night of the Living Dead, and that's how I spent my morning. Later on, I took my empty plate into the kitchen. I figured if my mother saw that I had cleaned the dishes, she wouldn't be as critical when she found the crumbs. I walked past Buster, who was slumped in his usual spot in the corner of the room, on a bed of now dirty sheets. In a joking manner, I asked him how his day was, while I washed up. Obviously, I got no reply. I remembered my sister's note and set a half-dried glass down while I fetched Buster some treats. I didn't know where Emily kept them, so I grabbed a slice of overly processed ham from the refrigerator. I crouched beside him and dangled it in front of his snout, teasing him, but there was no response. No slow opening of his eyelids, no methodic wag of his tail. There were no signs of life at all coming from Buster. I gasped, and I put my hand on his stomach, trying to feel it rise with his breath, or a heartbeat, or to feel anything. And in my horror, his abdomen began to compress when I did, like a limp, deflating balloon. He just felt hollow and empty. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled backwards. I put my hand on the counter, and with that I knocked over a glass, and it shattered on the kitchen floor. But Buster, he didn't even so much as flinch. I panicked and ran up to my room. I took my phone from my bedside cabinet and hastily rang my mother. It rang for a brief moment before she finally picked up. I managed to stutter out there that something was wrong with the dog, that it was an emergency. She assured me that she had just picked up Emily and she would be home in about 10 minutes. And with that, she hung up. I set my phone down and paced around my room. As I was thinking, I heard a noise coming from the first floor. It sounded like someone moving around. I assumed it was already my mother, home earlier than she estimated. I made my way downstairs to greet her, hurrying over the creaking steps. But there was no one. The door was still locked, and I, as far as I knew, was alone in the house. I heard the now familiar wag of Buster's tail as he came bounding up to me from the hall. I looked at him puzzled as he nestled his head into my legs. I stroked him behind the ears as he mewed low. And then I finally heard the equally familiar jangling of keys as the front door was unlocked. My mother stepped inside, pumping her umbrella. Emily, who was close beside her, ran to Buster and dropped to her knees as soon as she saw him. She hugged him tight and whispered in his flea-bitten ear. I could see her eyes were red, raw from crying. My mother asked me what the big emergency was, and I paused before answering. I explained that he had been unresponsive, but he seems to be fine now. My mother let out a long drawn-out sigh, and she made her way past us and into the kitchen. She called my name, frustrated, and when she saw the broken shards of glass on the kitchen floor, oh, I had forgotten about that. Emily spent the rest of the day in her room with her dog. At dinner, neither me nor my mother mentioned anything about Buster's false alarm. We just let my dad waiter on about improving his backswing, whatever that meant. For the third night in a row, I jolted awake in the small hours of the morning. I groaned about the abrupt ending of a good dream, tossing and turning until I found a comfy position. As I tried to get back to sleep, I began to feel a presence. It was the feeling you get during an awkward silence when you become painfully aware of another person. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes, trying to adjust them to the darkness. There was someone in the corner of my room. I was certain of it. I could make out the vague shadow-covered silhouette standing just beyond the foot of my bed. I was almost paralyzed with fear, but my right hand managed to creep over my bedside cabinet. I fumbled as I felt the familiar twitch of the lamp. Just before I turned on the lamp, the figure in my room bolted. I recoiled in shock as I realized my half-asleep mind had been right. Someone had been standing there watching me. As the moon emerged from a bank of clouds, my room was briefly lit with a dull glow. In the half-light, I saw the outline of a tall man sink out of my room and into the darkness of the hallway. I didn't realize I was screaming until my father burst into my room moments later. He switched on the lights, which burned my eyes. He held me and asked me what was wrong. With snot and tears dripping down my face, I managed to stutter that out there had been someone in my room. At this, my dad turned and ran back to his room. His caring embrace was quickly replaced with my mother's. He emerged with a baseball bat in his hands, gripping that bat so hard that his knuckles were white. My mother went to check on Emily. She made me come with her, not wanting to let her children out of her sight now. We barged into Emily's room. She was already awake, sitting upright in bed. My mother fired a barrage of questions at her, dazed. Emily told us that she hadn't seen anything at all. Finally, my father came back into the room about 10 minutes later. He informed us that he did a sweep of the house and he found nothing. No signs of a break-in at all. No mysterious intruder. He brought me back to my room, and once I was in bed, he sat beside me and explained to me that I had probably just had a bad dream. He said there was nothing to be afraid of, and joked that if someone did break into the house, they'd soon be scared off by Buster, the world's greatest guard dog. Eventually, I mustered the courage to fall back to sleep. The next morning, everyone in the family was noticeably tired. Even Buster. We greeted each other with yawns and joked about the previous night's events. I didn't know that this was the start of the last truly happy day of my life. My parents went out shopping. Emily took Buster for his first proper walk, and I spent most of the day gaming. It was a normal day. I've had dozens of days just like this. We had chicken breasts and bland steamed vegetables for dinner. Wednesday was family night, so after dinner we came together in the living room and played a board game. Tonight, it was Cluedo. Buster was curled up at Emily's feet. My father thought that was a good time to remind her that tomorrow he was bringing the dog to the vet and would hopefully reunite him with his real owners. And at this, Emily screamed that she was his real owner. She stormed out of the room, Buster following close behind. As soon as she slammed the door behind her, my dad sighed. He said he knew my sister would get too attached to that damn dog. This was the sour note the day ended on. At 10 o'clock, I did my usual routine. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas, and listened to music for about a half an hour or so before turning over and going to sleep. As I expected, I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, I was simply too afraid to move. Too afraid to open my eyes and see what could be lurking in my room. Instead, I kept them tightly shut and tried desperately to go back to sleep. After laying in bed for what felt like hours, it must have been only about 20 minutes though, I decided to open my eyes finally, and I was filled with a directionless dread as I slowly peeped out over my duvet. Since I had woken up, I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling that I was being watched. As I pulled the covers away from my face, I saw who had been staring at me. My bedroom door was wide open, and sitting perfectly still in the doorway was Buster. His head was craned slightly and looking directly at me. Now I chuckled to myself, realizing that I had been terrified about nothing. I swung my legs out of bed, and I got up. I took Buster by the collar and began to lead him back downstairs to his bed. As I walked down the hall, I noticed that the door to my sister's room was ajar. I brought Buster into the kitchen and watched as he laid down in the crumpled mess of cardboard and old blankets that he slept on. I smiled as he slumped his head onto his paws and closed his dreary eyes. I wouldn't exactly call him my best friend, but I would miss him after tomorrow. As I turned to leave to crawl back into bed and finally get some rest, something caught my eye out of the kitchen window. I leaned against the sill and looked out into the cold night sky. The moon was a perfect crescent, half hidden by the clouds. Light pollution from the nearby city robbed the sky of all the stars. But as I stared into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of a shooting star. As I gazed in awe to see if I could see another one, I saw someone. There was a person leaning against the fence along our front driveway. I quickly realized that it was Emily. I couldn't make out much in the darkness, but I could see that she looked nervous. I was about to open the window and call out to her when I heard something behind me. I turned around and realized it was coming from the dog. I assumed he had yelped in his sleep, maybe stuck in some bad dream. But then I noticed something else. His skin was moving. Rather, there was something moving around just under the surface of his skin. What the? I didn't have time to think what it could be before I saw the long, crimson red fingers protrude from his stomach. They grabbed onto either side of the now gaping wound and parted his abdomen like curtains. Once the opening was wide enough, the unnaturally long arm reached out, snaking across the kitchen floor until it grabbed the dining table's leg. It held onto it tightly as it began to pull the rest of it out of the dog's stomach and abdomen. I couldn't comprehend how something so large could have fit in that animalistic facade. Eventually, it was fully out and it stood upright. The figure must have been at least 3 meters tall. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling. It looked like it had been skinned. Its lanky body was made up of exposed sinew and muscle. The thing's eyes were milk white and bulging out of its vaguely dog-shaped head. It was simply grotesque. With a streak of urine now running down my legs, I turned around and ran as fast as I could upstairs. I burst into my parents' bedroom and stood in front of their bed, screaming and wailing about some monster. They were both shaken awake at my outpour of sheer terror. My father was calm at first. He tried to sit me down and tell me that it had all been just a bad dream, like the night before. I pushed him away and tried to articulate between the screams that there was an actual monster downstairs, and we had to leave now. My father quickly became furious at this. His anger was at me, and it was only amplified by his tiredness. He grabbed my shaking hands and began to shout that at 14, I was simply too old for all this, for any of this. But I was hysterical, and his attempt at reasoning did nothing. As I kept on wailing, he and my mother began a half-led, half-dragged me back to my room. Kicking and screaming, I fell onto my bedroom floor. I jolted at the noise of the slamming of my door, and I got to my feet. With tears streaking down my red cheeks, I pounded on the door. I heard my father's voice on the other side pleading with me to just calm down. Our shouting reached a feverish pitch, and then complete silence. We both stopped and listened out of the repetition of the noise that had brought our heated argument to an end. The dull thudding noise came again now, this time accompanied by a shrill creak. I realized that it was the sound of someone or something climbing the stairs. I took a tentative step back as the noise drew closer and closer, and in a weak voice, I heard my father stutter, "What? What are you?" I knew what he had seen. I spent the last 11 years blocking out the memory of what came next. There was screaming and pleading, the sound of flesh ripping and bone shattering. I sat motionless on the carpet of my bedroom floor as viscous blood began seeping in from under my door. The sounds of carnage stopped, and I held my breath as there was perfect silence once again. This silence was broken by the sound of my door slowly creeping open. I was petrified with fear, and I could do nothing. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I couldn't even breathe. The thing opened my door a crack before stopping. The slowly thudding noise returned as it walked away from the scene until I couldn't hear anything again. I stayed welded to that spot for a minute or two before grief hit me like a bus. I began sobbing until my eyes were raw. I stood up and took my phone from my bedside cabinet. I dialed 911 and desperately tried to explain what had happened. I glanced out my window and my jaw went slack. Walking down the middle of our street was the creature, caked in blood in the same shade as its taut skin. Holding its hand and walking next to it was my sister, Emily. She stared up at it with sheer affection. The two were illuminated by the street lights, and I saw that the creature was holding the fur suit that it had once been on Buster in the talons of its other hand. I watched as they walked down the street, across the sidewalk, and into the forest that surrounded my neighborhood. And that was the last time I ever saw my sister. Within the hour the police came. They cordoned off the area and took me in. I spent the next few years in foster care. The official statement they had given was that it was a kidnapping gone wrong. Only I and the officers and the coroner who saw my parents' remains knew that it was something much more sinister. That was 11 years ago, and tonight, as I finish writing this, before I begin a journey that I should have undertaken a long, long time ago, my sister Emily is still out there, somewhere. Now, I'm going to find her.